made us kings, and he made us priests. And he gave us this land to rule. He gave us life. And he told us to name things and to rule things and to rule them lawfully, justly, and correctly. Now, who gets the punishment if a law is broken? If someone commits murder, the penalty is death. A person kidnaps someone, the penalty is death. A manstealer. The penalty for rape is death. Now, we know what the crime is, and we know what the punishment is because it is written. Now, what is the penalty for the man who knows to do and does not? And that's what the part we were talking about earlier today. Because thou hast let go out of thy hand a man whom I have appointed to utter destruction, therefore thy life shall go for his life, and thy people for his people. 1 Kings 20:42. It is the law. The lawbreaker will be punished, or the person who should enforce the law, the king, will be punished, and his people will be punished. It is the law. Now, I used a case in point, I was getting ready to use a case in point, of the Southland. Of all parts of the country, there has never been, I think, a country more blessed than the Southland. We had our farms that were debt-free. We had slaves who were well cared for and well fed. We had crops and we had livestock. While the rest of the country was in the depths of a horrible depression in the 1850s, we didn't even know that there was trouble going on. We were debt-free. Our men were honorable, they were strong, they were gallant, they were intelligent, they made constitutions, and they dispensed law justly. The women were beautiful and brave. And all of a sudden, a tidal wave broke loose and spread over the land. Hundreds of thousands of people burning and raping and killing. Why? Why didn't we win the war? We had justice on our side. We were right. Why would the Lord let something like that happen to us? There is a master plan that it is wise for us to know about. It's not only wise, it is essential if we're to survive. The purpose of organized religion is to keep people from knowing God. And for doing that, they receive tax exemption. They do everything they possibly can to suppress the laws, statutes, and judgments. Seldom can you go into a church and hear the laws, statutes, and judgments and the laws of God preached. They can't do it and still receive tax exemption. Other books have been suppressed, one book after another. We had the Geneva Bible with the notes of Calvin, the notes of John Knox, the notes of Zwingli, elaborating difficult passages in the Bible, the masters. When our country was settled, everyone brought the Geneva Bible with them. The reformers all had the Geneva Bible, and King James couldn't wait to do away with it and issue his own Bible. The purpose of the King James Bible was to do away with the Geneva Bible. So he punished those who bought the Geneva Bible, and he made the King James Bible cheap, so gradually people switched. When the King James Bible was published, it contained the Apocrypha, the 10 books, the time from when we came back from the diaspora to Jerusalem to the time of Christ. That in 1825 that whole section was lifted out of the Bible, and a new edition of the King James Bible was published, leaving that out. Why? Because it had too much law in it. They had too many examples. They had too much to tell the people who might be oppressed. They had to get it out, and they did. And how much protest have you heard from the churches? None. How much protest have you heard from the seminaries? None. Now, what is this master plan? This is diabolical. Now, listen very closely. There was a man, his name was Josephus. He was a general in the armies of Palestine who were fighting the Romans. He was captured. And he could see the handwriting on the wall, so he got along with the Romans all right. And when the temple was crushed and the defenses around the temple were crushed, he went in, and out of that immense library, he came out with armful after armful after armful of the ancient manuscripts, and he wrote the book in the Antiquities, a book called Antiquities. No one argues about Josephus. The Jews accept him, Protestants and Catholics accept him, everyone accepts him, because there is nobody else writing during that period of time to the depth that he wrote. In the last generation, back in the 1800s, Josephus was read as much as the Bible is read. Everyone had a copy of Josephus's Antiquities in their household. Every educated household did. And they read it either in the Hebrew or in the Greek. Our grandfathers were very well educated. We forget that. Now, this came from the Antiquities. Now, here's the problem. There was a group who wished to destroy the Israelites because they were afraid of them, and they didn't know how to go about it. So they went to a prophet of Israel and said, how can we destroy the Israelites? And he said, don't go to war with them, because if you go to war with them, you'll lose. The way to destroy the Israelites is to get their God to destroy them. Now, how do you do that? You make the Israelites violate the law. And then that will make their God angry, and their God will destroy the people. Now, this is what I want you to do. If you would gain a victory over the Israelites, then do thusly. Set out the handsomest of your daughters. Then send them to be near the Israelites. And when they are enamored of them, persuade them to leave off their obedience to their own laws and the word of God who established them. For by this means their God will be angry with them. Antiquities 4:6, and will destroy them. Now, I hope you heard that loud and clear. They were not going to fight the Israelites. They were merely going to persuade the Israelites to violate the laws of their God. Then their God would destroy the Israelites. And why? Because their God does not lie. And he said that if his people violated his laws, then he would destroy his people. And the Israelite God keeps his promises. Coming down here, I jotted down a few things. Now, this is skipping a lot of time. This has to do with today. Now, remember the law that states, with people who lie and steal and cheat, with such people know not to eat. You remember that in Scripture? Have you ever wondered why they integrated the lunch counters? Do you ever wonder why the lunch counters used to be segregated? In New York, they were segregated. When I was a boy, I went to New York. The lunch counters were segregated. In Washington, D.C., and in Chicago, Illinois, the lunch counters were segregated. Besides the South. Why? Because with people who lie, who steal, who cheat, who fornicate, with such know not to eat. and to keep from violating the law of eating with strangers who do these things, they had separated lunch counters. And they passed a law integrating the lunch counters to force us to violate that scripture. That's law number 7. Integrated housing. They have forced people to live in integrated housing. Come out from among them and be ye separate, lest ye learn their ways. They have violated, number 7 again, a contract with God. They have passed another law. If you have a son to whom you wish to make a no-interest loan because your God forbids interest to your kinsman, and you make him a no-interest loan, it is assumed that you are paying or receiving interest, and you will pay taxes on it. And they have passed a statute to that effect. And that is to encourage you to charge interest on all loans to your kinsman, to force you to break the law of interest. Thereby, what is the penalty for charging interest to a kinsman? Death. False witness. We have media who present abortion as a good thing, the killing of children. Murder is a good thing. Now, what's the penalty for false witness? A false witness receives the punishment that the person who does the thing is to receive. If you tell a man to go out and murder somebody and he does it, well then, you have been a false witness to that man. You get the same punishment that that man gets. That's the law. These people on television tell you that abortion is good, that integration is good, mixed marriages is good, usury is good, fighting one's own kinsman is good, adultery is good. They are false witnesses, and they are to receive the punishment that people who follow their advice are to get. If they haven't received it, not in this country. You're supposed to love your mother and your father, and they have passed a ruling where children can bring charges of brutality against mothers and fathers for whipping them. To break up love thy mother and thy father. Abortion are encouraged. Murder. The penalty? Taxes. We are taxed. And no one protests. We're allowed to do it. Covet. On television, wives. Covet. They show things that would make you desire someone else's home, desire somebody else's wealth. All of this is part of the false witness. And to adulterate, number 7, contracts, to sue, encourage suits. They have encouraged the destruction of our people by making our God fight against us. Now remember, this morning, we discussed all the things that God would do to our people if we would not obey his laws and his statutes and his judgments. And we discussed further how these things were coming to pass. Now, this is the master plan. It is the plan of Balak. The idea is not to fight the Israelites, but to force the Israelites to break their laws so that their God will destroy them. This is a very smart plan. Now, we in the Southland, we violated laws. Why didn't we win the war? We didn't win the war because our 1,000-acre plantations were made up of plantations of many separate and different farms. They were monopolies. And what is the law against monopoly? Woe unto those that join host to host, that lay field to field, till there be no place, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. Isaiah 5:8. Monopolies are not allowed. You force people to go elsewhere. Instead of living on the land, you deprive them of their homes. I know you had to have 1,000 acres to make it pay, but the reason you had to have 1,000 acres to make it pay was because the next farm had slaves, and it needed 1,000 acres to make a plantation pay. And of course, the King of England forced the slaves on Virginia, and he got a cut to pay his interest. Nevertheless, we had monopolies. We had strangers in our midst. Receive a stranger into thine house, and he will disturb thee, and turn thee out of thine own house. That comes from Ecclesiasticus 2:11-34. Ecclesiasticus, part of the Apocrypha that has been cut from our Bible by our preachers of the established church. We also had strangers to rule over us. In the very top parts of our government, the Secretary of State was a stranger. You're not allowed to have a stranger to rule over you. We had wealthy priests. Priests are not allowed to be wealthy. Our priests had their own plantations. Our priests had their own carriages. Our priests were dependent on no one. The priests, the Levites, and all the tribe of Levi shall have no part, no inheritance with Israel. Therefore they shall have no inheritance among their brethren. The Lord is their inheritance. Deuteronomy 18:1-2. Now, when a priest is wealthy, it tells you one thing, that he has gained his wealth at the expense of his parishioners, because he speaks for God. And somehow or another, he is using that advantage to gain their wealth for his own advantage. And that cannot be allowed. And we cannot allow a priest to be wealthy. We are neither allowed to have kings to be wealthy. Kings who are wealthy, they forget, and they abuse the law. Taxes are forbidden. Now, we didn't have many taxes in Virginia, but we tolerated them elsewhere. It was all right if somebody else wanted to do it. If they wanted to tax land in Pennsylvania or Ohio, it was all right with us. We're kings. We didn't do it much. We didn't do it at all. But if they wanted to do it, that's perfectly all right. If the people in Ohio are not kings and don't own their own land, then it is only a question of time before the evil boils up. Now, we in Virginia, we were kings and we were priests. And we had our own debt-free plantations and debt-free farms. But if they wanted to charge usury up there in New York, that was all right. If they wanted to charge usury in Pennsylvania and out there in Michigan, well, everybody do what they want to do. That's all right. We tolerated evil. And we sat in our little haven, our little place, our little paradise, where the fences went straight, and the corn rows went straight as an arrow, and things were neat, and everything was clean, and there was honor, and there was peace. And all of a sudden, all hell broke loose in the land. All the evils which we had allowed to exist, all of these things had been cankering and festering and growing and multiplying, and they rose up like a gigantic wave, and they engulfed us. And of course, our noble Virginians all rushed to the colors. All of our militia companies marched away, and 61s with the bands playing. We fought it, countless battles, and we left our men. We made the sacrifice. We made the sacrifice. Our 10,000 Virginians on the killing fields of Gettysburg. In Lynchburg, Virginia alone, we've got 3,000 of our boys buried there on the hill in Lynchburg. Richmond, we got 20,000. In Petersburg, we've got 30,000. And I'm not counting about the other cemeteries all over the state of Virginia. Our state was burned, burned, burned. This man, Hunter, came from Lexington and burned that. He came down to Liberty City, or Bedford City it's now called. He burned a large part of that and hanged I don't know how many people. And they came to Lynchburg. They would go stand around the houses and hold hands. And they would sing, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And I hate that song to this day. I can't help it. It just... The people had been made wild. The soldiers had been made wild by the media. And why? They had told the people in the Northern Army that we tortured slaves, that we flogged slaves, that we were rigid and indolent in work. Not at all. And all the slaves were crisscrossed with stripes from the brutality and the brutal things we'd done to them. And the news told them, the false witnesses had told them to come down, that if they wanted to make money, the way to do it is go to any of our plantations and take the place to pieces, because there was hidden money everywhere. And they came down to teach us a lesson and to punish us. And things were just simply terrible. Oh, I mean, courage. If you want to hear stories, now Virginia is full of them. There was a fellow named Dahlgren. He was a colonel in the Union Army, good soldier, had one leg. And he came up with an idea to take 2,000 soldiers. And what he was going to do is make a fast, rapid raid to Lynchburg. You see, the fighting was going on down in Petersburg, south of Richmond, and they were going to make a rapid raid to Richmond. They were going to free all the Union prisoners there in Richmond, Virginia, and then they were going to burn the town, kill Jefferson Davis and all the Congress and everything, and then they were going to ride off. And there was nothing in the way. There was nothing. And they galloped in, but a slave saw them coming, and he galloped out while they were hung up on a creek that had gone out of its banks. He rode a horse into town, and he called the Little Boy Blues. Now, let me tell you who the Little Boy Blues. My great-great-great-granddaddy served with the 1st Virginia Continental Line down at Yorktown during the Revolutionary War. Now, that regiment, the 1st Virginia, was called the 1st Virginia during the War between the States, 1st Virginia Regiment. Now, I also served in that regiment, too, later on. Now, when those boys, they also got shot all to pieces up at Gettysburg. They had a bunch of boys, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, some of them 13, 14. But they had a bunch of them, there were 8. And they formed into a battalion. The Sons of the Blues were called the Little Boy Blues. And the little kids were like this tall, and the muskets are that tall, see? And they couldn't hold the muskets up because they were so heavy, especially with the bayonets on them. And what they would do, they had for the officers, they had one-armed soldiers and one-legged soldiers. They had been shot up in the war, and they came back, and that's what they had. And these little kids, you know, the muskets were much bigger than they were. And they say when Dahlgren rode up and saw the Little Boy Blues lined up in front of him, you could hear them laughing over on the hill. And they laughed and they laughed and they laughed. And then the bugle ordered the charge. And here they came. And this was a picked command. You got to hand it to the Yankees. They had some good soldiers. They really did. And the Little Boy Blues rested their rifles out in front of them because they couldn't hold them up more than a couple of seconds. And they waited until not a boy moved. You talk about discipline, that's good. With thundering horses coming down on top of them, not a boy moved. And the order came, present, fire. And it had to be that fast. Present, fire. And 10 yards away, at point-blank range, that doggone volley hit that line, you charging Yankee cavalry, and cut it all to pieces. And they went forward with their bayonets. And they did the work, and the rest of them got out of there. They went down to King William County, and the Little Boy Blues down, not the Little Boy Blues, the Boy Militia and Old Man Militia group down there finished them off, took care of every one. And that's where they saw the order. And the order was to to free the prisoners, kill all the members of the government, and burn the city down there. You see, that was a no-no back there then. They didn't believe it was possible for anybody to do anything like that. But that was part of it. You talk about sacrifice. Now, how's that for a sacrifice? You ought to see the little boys and the old man company, what they did down at Petersburg. They held back the whole Union Army. Now, of course, I've seen pictures of their bodies. Have you ever seen pictures of little 8-year-olds all curled up there with a bullet, half their head blown off with a big bullet, and old men with their long white beards like that, with a couple of kids laying on top of them? That's what it was like. Half of them got killed down there. Talk about glorious. It was glorious. And we've got a great tradition in Virginia. Have a picket's charge. Sacrifice, boy, we are good at it. We are real good at it. Petersburg boys, the picket's charge across the killing fields of Gettysburg, the Valley of Virginia, Atlanta, Charleston, Bellefontaine, Alabama, Cassville, Georgia, cities that no longer exist, that have been eradicated from the face of God's own earth. Let me read you just a story or two, because this, I have to tell you because nobody else is going to tell you. It happened in my family and nobody else knows anything about it. This is the knapsack story. Okay. Now this is what went on during this period of time, because this was policy. Looting was an accepted policy. It was the perk that went along with the job. Ships would bring up supplies up the Rappahannock River. They entered the home of my ancestor, Major William Hoskins of the Dragon, on the Dragon Run. The Dragon was almost 10 miles from the Rappahannock, far back in King and Queen County. Hoskins' mother was very old, sick, and bedridden. The sailors pulled her out of bed onto the floor and ripped open the mattress looking for the loot that might be hidden there. Wagons were brought to the door and everything of value was taken to a distant wharf to be loaded. When fully loaded, the ships cast off, leaving piles of household goods unable to be transported for lack of space. At the plantation of my mother's family at Kelly's Ford in northern Virginia, on the line between Culpeper County and Fauquier County in northern Virginia, everything that could possibly be transported was loaded onto confiscated wagons and the whole lot taken along with the regiments. This was not an isolated occurrence. Scores of regiments came through. Each regiment did the same, and each time they garnered less and less. Toward the end, even the chairs, beds, kitchen utensils, and children's toys were gone. At that time, the wives and children of the scattered family had refugees at Kelly's Ford, and there were over 40 of them present. There were over 50 slaves that were called contraband that had not been taken prisoner and carried off. My great-grandfather was away on a business trip to Fredericksburg, where he owned a woolen mill, Kelly, Tackett, and Ford, which made gray cloth for Confederate uniforms. A Union regiment came through going south. There was only food remaining to take care of the family and the slaves for a week. The rest had taken shelter. The rest had been taken earlier. The soldiers took this food, and that which was not needed was poured from the containers into a pile on the floor, and salt and molasses poured over it to make it unusable. Off the regiment marched, laughing, with chickens and geese impaled on bayonets. There was one Union soldier who stayed behind. He came up to my great-grandmother and said, "Mrs. Kelly, I'm ashamed of what my comrades did. Here's my knapsack, which I filled with all the food I could. I hope it will help until Mr. Kelly gets home." The contents of that knapsack, carefully rationed, helped feed 90 people for 3 days. Now, the story doesn't end there. President Davis invited certain citizens of the Confederacy to Richmond to show them the workings of the government and a war effort. The tour included the Richmond forts, the Naval Yard, Tredegar Arsenal, and Ironworks. And one of the trips was to Belle Island, which was in the middle of the James River under the present Lee Bridge. This was where enlisted Union prisoners were kept. Granville Kelly was in the group being taken around by President Davis when a Union prisoner rushed past the guard and stopped in front of him and said, "Mr. Kelly, you don't know me, but I'm the one who left the knapsack full of food for your family. If there's anything you can do to get me out of here, I certainly would appreciate it." My great-grandfather said to him, "I know exactly who you are, and I want to tell you that I and my family are indebted to you." And then he walked over to President Davis and explained the matter to him. President Davis issued orders to have the man paroled immediately, an act which may have saved his life, since Lincoln had discontinued the exchange of prisoners by then. After the war, when times were so hard, the soldier would journey to Kelly's Ford at harvest time and help gather in the crops. Now, isn't that a good story? It is better to obey than sacrifice. And we self-satisfied Virginians, with our wealth and our crops, had allowed evil to take place in other parts of the nation. And we figured that since we were kings and priests and entitled to do what we wanted, that others were kings and priests and they could do what they wanted. Now, the law states that the penalty for usury that's a capital crime. The law states the penalty for murder and for rape and for kidnapping is death. And for false witness, a man who encourages war and mayhem, he is to get what he encourages someone else to get. He is a false witness. We let all those things slide. We were tolerant people in Virginia. We were tolerant. Now listen what the tolerance got us. Because thou hast let go out of thy hand a man whom I have appointed to utter destruction, therefore, this is a law. And I come from a race of people who know that God enforces his law. Therefore, thy life shall go for his life, and thy people for his people. 1 Kings 20:42. Now, to obey is better than sacrifice. We know what we had done wrong. If we had won the war in the Southland, we would have institutionalized usury, allowing strangers in our land, allowing strangers to rule over us, land monopolies. We would have allowed all those things, and we would have institutionalized them, and we would have taken them into the promised land. And God was not going to let any people into his promised land with things like that. Now, while we didn't win the war, the North sure didn't win the war either, because we know what has happened to the North. All those boys who came marching down with the promises in their ears full of lies, they have all lost their farms, they have all lost their land, and their cities lie in desolation today. And they sit among this audience right here along with us, one part of a great, big, disobedient people. Now, question: who is to enforce the law? The authorities? Of course. The authorities are supposed to enforce the law. Suppose, however, you have lawless strangers who are the authorities, and they do not enforce the law. Then what? Now, what does the law say? There is a law to fit everything God speaks and not us. The law states it is better to obey God than man. Right? That is the law. Obey those who have rule over thee. True, we are to obey those who have rule over us. if those who have rule over us are lawless, then what are we to do? It is better to obey God than man. Or else, speaking as a southerner, we will undergo again what we underwent before. I can speak from experience. The scripture states this: who is to enforce the law? The hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hands of all the people. Deuteronomy 17:5-7. Because thou hast let go out of thy hand a man whom I have appointed to utter destruction, therefore thy life shall go for his life, and thy people for his people. 1 Kings 20:42. Now let me tell you what happened next. The war was over. But it wasn't over. It wasn't over. The people didn't stomp us into the ground for nothing. Everything pays. Everything can be made to pay. One of the first things they did was pass a law saying anybody who taken arms in the revolution could not vote. That meant no white man could vote, because we all fought in the war. Women couldn't vote. That meant no one could vote in the States. Then they passed a law saying the blacks could vote. Then the big bankers up in New York sent what is called carpetbaggers down south to instruct the new voters on how to vote. They instructed them to vote big taxes and to spend money. So the taxes grew quite high, and trade was very depressed. Taxes went up 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 times. And plantations that had been developed for 300 or 200 years started coming on the market. Can you imagine what a plantation would look like after it has been developed for 200 years? Can you imagine what that house, cottage house, would look like with the 3 dormers and the white picket fence and the barns and the rail fences and the terraces and the high pastures and the low pastures and the oat barns? And can you imagine what a plantation like that would look like? It would take your breath away. I've seen some examples of that. That's what it was like. They bought those plantations up for $50. Plantations that in 1858 had sold for $800 an acre. Now, here was the plan. They planned on taking these plantations and selling them to immigrants from Europe. Now, they own millions of acres. The big land companies up in New York own millions of acres of their land. Now, if you buy something for 2 cents an acre and you sell it for $400 an acre, you know that's like good markup. And you can really make a buck on that. We're talking about great big bucks right now. But something went wrong. And that same something will go wrong again. And I'm telling you about it so you'll know about it and know that it can happen anytime. It was called black nationalism. Now, I don't want to drop this subject too soon because there's a lot to be learned from the aftermath of the war between the states, because that's sort of like the period we're in right now. You may have white rule that is benign, helpful, where people are well taken care of, where they're well fed and contented. And blacks will every time choose to be ruled by one of their own. And it makes no difference if that person is brutal, mean, or killer. Whatever that leader says, that is the thing they're going to do. Now, I'm just telling you that because That's what history has always told us. They will follow their own leaders to destruction, to anything. What their leader says is what our God says. Everything he says is tremendously important, tremendously funny, tremendously wise, and it's what they're going to do. And they got the notion that they didn't want to share the wealth with the carpetbaggers any longer. And they didn't want any immigrants coming into the Southland. And so they stopped it. They stopped it dead. And when they stopped it dead, what were these bankers going to do? What were these land companies going to do with their millions of acres of land? What happens to land if you don't take care of it, if it's got no one on it? It grows up, right? It grows up into scrub pine. It becomes worthless as plantations, top dollar plantations, and that's all that they were looking for in that day and time. Now, I'm going to drop the subject just a minute, but I'm going to come back to it. Now, we've got the beginning of a fuss. We've got the Southland stomped into the ground. The whites could not vote. And there was a reign of terror in the South, the likes of which you cannot imagine. We had black mayors, black House of Delegates, black state senators, black congressmen, black senators, black lieutenant governors. We had the works. They voted themselves anything they want. And our great Capitol building in Richmond, Virginia, with its beautiful columns up the front, designed by Tom Jefferson himself, they had a party up on the second floor. One of those big bashes with a great big kegs of whiskey and everything, and they were really having one of those knockdown soccer Friday night bashes that only blacks can have. And the floor fell in. And it killed an awful lot of them. And Richmond put on mourning for all those black, legislators who had been killed. I think they had the flags flying at half-mast, I don't know how long. It's Martin Luther King Day all over again. And it was really a tragic time. It really was. Down in Tennessee, they organized a group of lawyers, broke, were getting ready to go to a party. And they didn't have any costumes, so what they did was they put on sheets. Of course, that's the closest thing it could come to a costume, see? And that day and time, all the Catholic bigwigs had some sort of crazy-looking hat that went up to a point, up in top, see? And 4 or 5 of them got on their horses with these sheets on and these hats that went up to a point, and they started galloping off to the party. And they thought it would be a dandy idea to stop by a revival that was taking place, a colored revival that was taking place. And so what they did was it was nighttime. And the revival was going on, and they just rode by the windows. And all of a sudden, the colored people in there looked out there, and here were these people, and they must have been 10 feet tall, because they were sitting on the horses. That made them tall. And they were looking in the windows. These tall people who were white, and they had these tall, pointed heads. They had to be spirits, and they decided to get out of there. I mean, all at the same time, and the windows on the other side, and it was some sort of drop of maybe 8, 10 feet to the ground. And I don't know how many of them got hurt, but the idea took hold that might be a good thing to do every Friday night, Well, that was a good as far as it went. But our opposition is smart as a whip. No sooner than that started happening than they started scaring some of these black soldiers and black sheriffs and black legislators and started pushing them around a little bit. Then the news got hold of it. And the media got hold of it, and they built it up that the South was unrepentant, it was evil as they had ever been, they were simply awful. And they had to put more soldiers in the South to keep this type of thing down, and to keep the whites down and keep the blacks in power. And they used that as an excuse. And there was no way to reply to it. At least they didn't think of any way to reply to it. And so they disbanded those. It was disbanded 18 months from the day it was formed. The life of the first Klan was 18 months. That's all. That's as long as it lasted. That doesn't mean that everybody just went home and forgot about it, because there was no police in the South. Now, I can't tell you what that really means. Women going to market had to wait until they had 50 or 60 of them together in a group, or else they would be taken singly or in twos or threes or fours and repeatedly raped by Negro companies. Now, that's a bad state of affairs. You would come home to your farm and find 50 or 100 niggers occupying your place. Now, what are you going to do with 50 or 100 niggers armed occupying your place? That's bad news. It's real bad news. So, people had to provide their own police. Somebody had to do something to protect the people. But they had no names. There were no name organizations. But that didn't stop the Klan. A new Klan came into existence. And it was formed by Union soldiers and Union League members. Now, there were scalawags and carpetbaggers who had come down. The Klan was such good media material that they had to keep it going. So they kept this bogus Klan going to do awful things to the blacks and blame it on the white Southerners. And every word, every story, every atrocity was religiously reported in Washington and New York and Chicago, and the whole North after the war between the states thought we in the South were just simply awful. Now, I've got to return to this place where we've got a big falling out between the bankers in New York and the blacks who don't want them to sell their land to white people, because things got so bad in the Southland that people started leaving. And they started leaving in droves. Many of you live in other states are descendants from Southerners who left the South during this period. We had to get out of there. In Richmond, Virginia, in Lynchburg, Virginia, they would take an old man and they would, the Negro soldiers or police, and throw him up against the wall and spit in his eye. And if he tried to wipe his eyes from the sting, oh, that was getting ready to strike a officer of the law, and they'd beat him up, throw him in jail, and they'd fine him. Things got just real serious. The South was getting ready to be denuded of people. My granddaddy and my grandmama met all the way there in Missouri. They had refugees. They couldn't live in Virginia. Things were too awful. They had lived 10 miles apart in Virginia and had never known each other. They met right there in Missouri and got married. And they moved on to Texas. And that's the story of the Texas Rangers I want to tell you about. But I want to start one at a time. I'm real sorry. I've got to stop right now. But when I start up again tomorrow morning, I'm going to tell you how the media in the North, the bankers' media, turned the entire North from hating the South, and they'd hated us for 50 years. They hated us with a venom that you can't imagine. And within 6 months' time, everybody in the North loved us. And we were misunderstood and unappreciated, and people really didn't understand the situation. And it was all done in 6 months. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to tell you how they did it. Thank you.